We are continuing our journey through the book of Ephesians. Ephesians is a letter in the New Testament that the Apostle Paul writes to a church in Ephesus. Now, we're told in the book of Acts, which is the book in the New Testament that tells us about kind of the origin and expansion of the early church, that Paul goes to Ephesus twice. Once he goes there very briefly, but then he comes back and he stays for over 2 years. And while he's there, he starts a church, encourages the church, builds up the church. And then eventually he leaves Ephesus and continues on planting churches all over the Roman Empire, gets thrown in jail, arrested, thrown in jail, and he ends up in jail in Rome. And so while he's in jail in Rome, he's writing this letter back to this church in Ephesus, this church that he knows really well, this church that he loves. And he's writing this letter to teach them and to encourage them. Ephesus, you can tell from this map, is right in the heart of the Roman Empire, right in the heart of the Mediterranean world. And Ephesus is a hugely important city. It's an important political city, it's an important economic city, it's an important spiritual city within the Roman Empire. And so it's a very difficult place to be a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus. The best estimates we kind of have are at the time Paul writes this letter, the population of the Roman Empire is about 60 to 70 million. There are roughly 1,500 Christians in the whole empire at this time. So it is this very small minority of people, and for the people living in Ephesus, they're living in a very wealthy, affluent, powerful, influential place, a very Roman place. And so Paul's writing this letter to say, hey, here's what it means, here's what it looks like to live faithfully to Jesus in this city in which you find yourselves. And Paul writes several letters that we have in the New Testament, and a lot of those letters follow kind of a similar format. That Paul will begin his letters by kind of laying the foundation of faith, what is often referred to as the gospel. Gospel is a word that means good news. And the New Testament writers would use the word gospel to talk about Jesus and the impact of Jesus' life, death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. And the essence of the gospel was that God came to earth in the person of Jesus. And Jesus, through his death and his resurrection, is overcoming evil. And Jesus has now ascended into heaven, and he is king, and he's making the world right. So that's like the heart of the gospel. And that's what Paul gets at in the first part of Ephesians. And Paul's saying, hey, this is what God is up to. That everything that's broken in creation, God is bringing it back together under King Jesus. Right? Jesus is now, because of his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, he's king. He's making everything right. So that's where Paul will begin. And then the second part of Paul's letters, a lot of times will be far more practical, because Paul will go on to say, and here's the implications of that. Because Jesus is king, because he's making everything right, here's now how we should live. And a couple of the things Paul talks a lot about in Ephesians that we've spent the last few weeks looking at is Paul will say, because Jesus is king, you and I are new people. Right? Because of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, there is forgiveness, and there is grace, and there's restoration, and you and I become new people. In another letter Paul writes in the New Testament, he uses the language of new creation, that we are new people. Another big emphasis Paul makes in Ephesians is that not only are we new people, but the church is this whole new community. We're a united community. Paul will say that whatever it was that divides us in our lives, that Jesus has broken down the dividing wall of that hostility and made in himself a new humanity. And so Paul's talked a lot about, hey, here's what it means to be a new person. Here's what it means to be a new community. And what Paul's going to do today is he's going to talk about what does it mean to be a new household or a new family. So Paul's going to apply the same thing. He's going to say one of the implications of the gospel is how we function as actual families. And he's going to do that using a pretty well-known genre in the Greco-Roman world that's referred to as household codes. Now, household codes at this point had been around several centuries. Actually, to go back to the Greek philosopher Plato, if you're familiar with Plato. You're probably familiar with his name, even if you don't know his work, but he's around several centuries before Paul, and he's known for all of his philosophy. But one of the things Plato does is he creates what become known as household codes. And they're exactly like what they sound. They're codes that say, hey, this is how a household should function. And after Plato, Aristotle, who's one of his students, Aristotle will build on Plato's household codes. And then in the centuries that follow, you'll have all kinds of Greek philosophers that will develop their own household codes. And there's no natural evolution of household codes in the Greco-Roman world. basically each philosopher makes them up according to what they think are their virtues. So they'll say, hey, here's what I think are virtuous behaviors, so this is what should define household codes. And the important thing about household codes is household codes were generally created in order to reinforce the existing social structures of the greater society. So every society that has ever existed has social structures. And it has hierarchies of where people rank. And those rankings can be based, depending on what society you're talking about, they can be based on gender, they can be based on socioeconomics, how much money do you have, political power, they can be based on race or ideology or any one of a number of things. But you will have a social order. And so when these philosophers would create these household codes, they would create household codes that were intended to reinforce this dominant social order. Because the family, the household, was meant to be seen really as a microcosm of society. That how do we build the best society is we reinforce it at the household level. So this is what household codes were designed to do. And so this genre, this style of let's create household codes has been around for several centuries. And what Paul's going to do here in Ephesians is he's going to really create household codes in light of the gospel. Paul's going to say, because Jesus has become king and is making everything right, because we are new people, because we are a new community, here's what it looks like to be a new household. And he's going to address specific relationships within first century households. He's going to address wives, husbands, children, parents, and he's also going to include slaves and masters. And we're going to look at what he says to each one of these, but I want to say this right from the very start. A lot of times, this particular text, and this isn't the only place in the New Testament you find household codes. Paul also uses them in Colossians, and then Peter will use them. I believe it's in 1 Peter. But a lot of times, these household codes throughout the years have been used to justify oppression. They've been used to justify oppression when it comes to gender, and they've been used to justify oppression when it comes to the issue of slavery. Now, we're going to look at what Paul's going to say to each one of those individually, but I want to say this right from the beginning. I think every time these are used to justify any kind of oppression, I just imagine Paul being furious and ripping his hair out, because that is not at all what he intended. If you read these and use these to justify oppression, you are completely misunderstanding what it is that Paul's saying, because what Paul is actually doing is contrary to what household codes were typically used to do. Again, household codes were typically used to reinforce the existing social structure. What Paul's going to do with his household codes is flip the social structure completely upside down. I mean, it's going to be this, it's not even like a shift. It is just like, let's completely just overturn the apple cart, because this is something brand new and completely different. But what we do is we tend to isolate these one at a time, and when you isolate them, then you can say, oh, well, this is why this person's better than this person, or that person's better than this person. The thing that's most important to remember is Paul is not looking at these different relationships between husbands and wives and children, and he's not looking at them isolated. He's talking about it as it functions within one entire household. Because in the first century world, and this is still largely true in our world, when you talk about a family in the first century world, Lynn Cohick, who is a scholar and a professor, she says that families in the first century world, households, were places of economics, but they were also places where you were cared for. And so when you talk about a household is really the all-encompassing well-being of a person. This is like when you would get money, when you would get jobs, that was usually in the first century world tied to your family. You went into like the family business, or you fall. And so a lot of the economics of how you survived, how you provide, how you got food was tied in to your family. But also when it came to whatever relational aspects you needed. When it came to care and to teaching and to instruction and formation. And N.T. Wright, who's a British scholar, probably the most well-known New Testament scholar on the planet, N.T. Wright reminds us that within first century families, this is where faithfulness to God was kind of born, but also where it was sustained. And so when you talk about the family, or specifically the household, this is the entirety of a person's well-being. This is about their economics, this is about their relationships, this is about their spirituality. And so what Paul's doing is he's addressing all of the potential relationships that might exist in a household unit together. And so what he's arguing for is really how should a household govern? Now, a lot of us probably live in what might be traditional households. We have, husband and wife, and we have children. Others of us don't live in traditional households. We may be empty nesters, maybe we're single, maybe we're not, whatever it is. So some of us may look at this and go, oh, well, this doesn't apply to me because I don't live in this reality. I don't have all these relationships. Even when you get down to slaves and masters, we don't operate with slaves and masters or anything like that. A lot of times people will try to apply that to work. Paul's not talking about work. He's talking about households here. So I think what Paul's going to say, you can apply it to work, but that's not what he's getting at. Paul's saying, hey, when it comes to this unit that functions for our overall well-being, how do we treat one another? How do we operate? And so I think as we look at this, what Paul's saying, yes, it's applicable to our individual family units, husbands, wives, children, but it also can be applicable to roommates if we live with roommates. It can be applicable to our extended family. How do we engage with aunts, uncles, cousins? Or even you may have a close group of friends that you would define yourselves as, hey, we do life together. This is really what Paul's getting at. Paul's going to say that collection of people that are kind of like, this is our intimate collection. This is where, financially, economically, spiritually, relationally, where we're connected and most nourished. And again, typically that's the family unit, but it can't extend beyond that. Paul's going to say, this is what it should look like. And everything Paul's going to say here is really based on one command that Jesus gave his followers. On what we call the Last Supper, when Jesus is surrounded by his apostles, he looks at them in John 13:34 and he tells them this. He says, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. This is the one time Jesus uses the word command. He looks at him and says, here's this command, a new command. This is a brand new command. What I want you to do is I want you to love each other the same way that I have loved you. Jesus then is going to go out and give up his life for them. And so this is the driving ethic. So essentially, this is what Paul's going to base his entire household codes on. Again, remember, most household codes are based on, reinforcing some kind of social hierarchy. Paul's going to say, my household codes are based on this one command. Do for others what Jesus has done for us. And Paul's going to say, this is what that looks like. And if we do that, if that's what we embody in our households, then we turn the typical idea of household, what it means to be a family, what it means to be married, completely upside down. And it all really hinges on one idea. Paul has one guiding principle that is true for every relationship within the household. And he states it right from the very beginning. Ephesians 5:21, he says this, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That right there is Paul's whole point. Everything else he's going to say about every other specific relationship is that. That's Paul's point. Paul says, here's how households should function. We should be mutually submissive to one another. Which again, this is totally counter because in the Greco-Roman world, you have these hierarchies. And obviously men are at the top of that hierarchy. Men essentially, if you look at the way family units functioned, household functions in the Greco-Roman world, men ran their household like a monarch. They could kind of do whatever they wanted. And so there's this hierarchy. Paul says, no, not in light of Jesus. In light of Jesus, in light of the gospel, in light of his command for us to love one another as he has loved us, and in light of what he actually did, that he gave up his life for us, here's the governing principle of our household. That we live mutually submissive to one another. Again, this is a complete overthrowing of the status quo. Now, this sounds like a great idea. And for a lot of us, it's like, okay, well, this might not be anything new. It's like, yeah, this sounds really cool. But here's where it gets really complicated. Not all of the relationships in a household are the same. So what it means to be mutually submissive to my spouse is not the same thing as what it means to be mutually submissive to my children. So how do you do this in each of these unique relationships? In all the unique relationships that we find ourselves in, what does it look like to actually do this? Because it's not the same in every single one of them. This is why Paul's going to go on and give specific examples. He's going to say, this is what this looks like among spouses. This is what it looks like with parents and children. So I want to look at these really quick. And just for the record, Paul goes into some detail and says some really cool things. And if you're interested in this, it's worth going back and kind of diving into specifically what Paul says. He'll get into some interesting metaphors that I think are really kind of powerful. And so you can get yourself a good commentary or get online and get something that can kind of help you understand it. But our goal is we want to see Paul's big picture. Because again, Paul's main point here is how do we function as a household? What's the big picture? So we're going to kind of skim through this looking for the big picture. And here's how he begins. Ephesians 5, verse 22, and then skipping to verse 25. He says, wives, submit yourself to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Then in verse 25, he says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So he starts by addressing husbands and wives, and he starts, in my opinion, I don't know that he did this on purpose or not, I like to think he did, he starts by being as least controversial as he can be. Let's just start with an easy one. Wives, submit to your husbands. Because everybody's like, well, yeah, of course, like that's kind of the status women already have, so they're not going to object to that, and the husbands are going to be like, well, yeah, of course, that makes total sense. So he starts with this one that's just like really easy, almost like this is obvious, this is taken for granted. This is what you do. But what's interesting is the New Testament's originally written in Greek. And if you look at this in Greek, what Paul says to wives, it's not worded in such a way as like this is a command. It's worded in such a way as like, well, this is what you do. But what he says to husbands is actually a command. He tells them, this is what you do. And for Paul, this is really important. What Paul's writing here to the church in Ephesus, he's not writing this as advice. He's not saying, hey, as a relationship expert, this is what I think you should do, partly because Paul's not a relationship expert. Not at all. Paul's saying, this is what we do because of Jesus. So Paul says, wives, submit to your husbands, you know that, but husbands, here is my command to you. And notice the language he used. Love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up. Again, he almost quotes Jesus directly. Remember Jesus? Love one another as I have loved you. And so actually the command that Paul gives to husbands is far more submissive and sacrificial than what he tells women to do. Paul says, husbands, you have to be willing to give up everything for her sake and for her benefit. That is the ultimate act of submission. Now, for most of us, it may not ever come to that. So we just think like, oh, I would be willing to do that. Okay, well, are you really going to be willing to give up your life for your spouse if you won't even, I don't know, do the laundry every now and then? Put away the dishes, cook a meal, go shopping? See, maybe loving your wife the way that Christ loved the church, maybe that means you don't just go home today and plop on the couch and watch football, but I don't know, maybe you do the shopping. Maybe you take care of the kids. See, what Paul is commanding of men is actually far more submissive. And really, the reason he's doing this, Paul's not dumb. Like, most of Scripture is addressed to people that have the most power. At least the command parts of it. And men clearly have the most power. And so Paul's saying, you having the most power also means you have the most to sacrifice and the most to give up. And so what he commands for men is far more submissive and even far more radical, because Paul's saying, yeah, you know what we're doing? We're completely remaking marriage in light of Jesus and the gospel. So then he goes on, and now he's going to address children and parents. Ephesians 6:1, he says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. So he tells children, like, hey, obeying your mom and dad is actually important. Your mom and dad have a divinely given task to raise you. Your mom and dad have a divinely given task to form you. All right, and so he'll quote from the Old Testament, and he'll talk about how, you know, kind of that parent-child relationship is key to Israel being Israel, because again, having healthy families is part of the foundation of having a healthy society. And so he's going to talk about that. He's going to talk about how important that is. And you know, your mom and dad may not be right all the time, but they are your mom and dad. And then he does something that I believe is completely unfair. He addresses only fathers. Doesn't say anything to mothers for the rest of it. He goes only at dads. And here's what he says to dads. Ephesians 6:4, he says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Doesn't say anything else to moms. It's like, moms, you're doing good. You're killing it. Way to go. Dads, come here. Lean in for a second here. Dads. And then he like reprimands us, which I'm like, that's not fair, but I'll also say this. I think it's completely accurate and appropriate because of what he says. And again, remember, Paul's writing to those who have the most power, which in that culture is men's, is husbands, is fathers. They rule their family, not just their wife, but also their children like a monarch. And what Paul says here is generally true of most fathers. Now, I know it's not true of all fathers, and what he's going to say in some cases is going to be true of mothers. And I think there's stuff that all of us can take from it, but he says what he says here because it's generally true of fathers. He says, fathers, quit exasperating your children. Don't make them angry. Don't make them mad. And dads, we tend to do that. Moms, when they correct children, tend to be more to the point and more gentle. A mom will walk into a messy room and she will say, honey, you left your room a mess. You need to clean it up before you go to bed next time. It's to the point, it's gentle, it's direct. A dad will walk into that same room that's a mess and will say, you really think this was a good idea? And they'll say it with an agitated voice, and they'll say it in this way that's like kind of passive aggressive, that is intending to draw out a response from the child, to which the child generally responds poorly. Dads, we tend to respond poorly back, and it escalates into a fight. That's what we do. Dads, we tend to do that because we just tend to be more aggressive. We tend to be more competitive. We want to be right. And so we tend to agitate our children in trying to make our point. We have 2 dogs, and I've talked about our dogs at different times. I've even shown pictures. What I don't talk about as much is we also have 2 guinea pigs, Izzy and Gibby. And there's a rumor in my house that I hate our guinea pigs, which is false, by the way. It's not, no matter what my children tell you, I actually do love our guinea pigs. But I will also tell you, I'm not as fond of our guinea pigs as I am of our dogs. And it's nothing against our guinea pigs. I never had guinea pigs growing up. But some of it just has to do with how we got the guinea pigs. My daughter came down one day downstairs, and she had put together a PowerPoint presentation of why we should get guinea pigs. And she'd done all this research and all this kind of stuff, and she did it. And so we talked about it as a family, should we get guinea pigs? Can we get guinea pigs? And we had kind of decided like, yeah, we can get guinea pigs. That's okay. And then one night, my son and I were going out, and my daughter really wanted to get guinea pigs. Actually, my son and I were coming to church here, and my daughter's like, can we get guinea pigs? Can we get guinea pigs? And as Jeremy and I were leaving, we were like, well, I mean, if you guys want to, you can go get them. We've kind of already decided. And so Jeremy and I are driving down the street, and I looked at him in the car. I go, $20 says there's guinea pigs when we get back home. And when we got back home, there was guinea pigs. We had guinea pigs. We've had guinea pigs ever since. And so the dogs, like I was there when we picked the dogs out. I have that like emotional attachment. Our dogs are rescue dogs. But the guinea pigs just kind of showed up in the house one day. So I don't have quite the same emotional attachment to them. I don't hate them. I don't despise them. But I do sometimes get frustrated when I clean the guinea pig's cage out, because if you've never done that, it's super gross. And our guinea pig cage, amen, right over here, I heard that. Our guinea pig cage is kind of elevated, so my kids are too small to get down in there and reach the bedding. So Linda or I usually have to do it. And I just am in a bad mood when I do it. I'm going to tell you that. Like, I could be in a great mood all day, and then Katie would be like, we need to clean out the guinea pig cage. And just boom, you can see it in my face. I get in a bad mood. I don't want to do this. And I do it kind of bitterly about it. So usually my wife, God bless her, she changes the guinea pig cage more often because she's in a better mood about it. But on Friday, my wife was not home, and the guinea pig cage was smelling. And my daughter's like, Dad, could we change out the bedding in the guinea pig cage? And I said, sure. I wanted to be nice. I wanted to help my wife out so that when she came home from work, didn't have to clean the guinea pig cage. So I'm cleaning the guinea pig cage out, and it's just caked in poo. And my daughter's sitting there, and I do like this thing that I do sometimes, that dads we do sometimes, and this is what Paul's talking about, is I just kind of like passively aggressively start talking about how much this sucks. And I'm like, Katie, this poo is caked on here. This is disgusting. These guinea pigs are disgusting. And she's like, I know, Dad, I know. You say this every time. And then when I change the guinea pig cage, I use like vinyl or latex gloves. But every time I do that, the glove breaks, and I get guinea pig poo in my nails. And so I'm like digging through, and I look up, and the gloves are broken. I'm like, Katie, now there's guinea pig poo in my nails. This is disgusting. And she's getting more and more agitated. And everything that I'm saying, like, I'm not wanting to do this, but everything I'm saying is just escalating her and escalating her. And I'm like, I'm covered in guinea pig poo. This is disgusting. These things are disgusting. Their bedding costs this much. Their food costs this much. Finally, my daughter's like, fine, next time I'll just ask Mom to do it. And then I take the thing downstairs, and I'm throwing away the trash, and I'm just thinking to myself, Scott, you're an idiot. Why would you do that? But dads, for whatever reason, we tend to do that. And again, I know some of you are sitting there thinking like, well, I'm the dad. I don't do that, but my wife does that all the time. Like, okay, sometimes it can be both of us. But in general, it tends to be dads, we just tend to do that. Instead of being gentle and direct, we kind of tend to aggravate. And we tend to push, and we tend to demand. And let me just tell you something. I don't mean this to be judgmental at all. I was a youth minister in this city for 10 years. Dads, we put a lot of pressure on our kids to achieve academically and athletically, and they know it, and they feel it, and it impacts them in a very negative way. And this is what Paul's getting at. Paul's saying, listen, you have to be careful. Listen, what moms say to their children matters deeply. But sometimes, especially when it comes to girls, if I'm going to be honest, dads, what we say and the way we say it, man, it stays with them. So Paul says, man, be careful. Like this, as a father, and again, as a mother too, that's equally applicable, but Paul's talking to, it's like, this is probably the most important thing you'll ever do in your life, is raise your child or raise your children to be who God created them to be. So be careful with how you do that. Be careful with what you say. Be careful with the way that you react. Don't exasperate them. Don't make them angry. Yes, you have to correct them. Yes, you have to teach them. Yes, sometimes you have to discipline them. Yes, sometimes you have to be strict. But you can do it in a way that is gentle and that is kind and that is loving and doesn't exasperate them and make things even worse. So Paul says, dads, be really careful with that. And then Paul addresses one more dynamic. Ephesians 6, verse 5, and then skipping to verse 9, he says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. And then in verse 9 he says, and masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Now we already talked about a little bit how this particular passage in Ephesians has been used to justify sexism. It's also been used and has been used and continues to be used to justify racism and particularly the institution of slavery. So I want to talk about that real quick because I want us to be clear about what Paul is actually saying here. Some people have used this and other texts in the New Testament to say, oh, well, see, Paul's pro-slavery. Paul likes slavery. He's not. And if you think that's what he's saying, you're completely missing the point. Because one thing that we have to understand is when the New Testament, any New Testament writer, Paul here, when they talk about slavery, their idea of slavery is different from what you and I think of when we think of slavery. When we talk about slavery in an American context, we're talking about chattel slavery. That was racial oppression. That was white people oppressing black people. It was a racist and evil institution. Paul is living in the midst of the Roman Empire, which slavery in the Roman Empire existed long before Paul and it continued long after Paul. And Paul's not arguing here that slavery is good or natural. But Paul's also not dealing with the same kind of slavery that we think of as American chattel slavery. Actually, when you look at it, the word slave, the English word that we use slave, comes from the word Slavic because the original, like European slaves, were white. And so slavery in the Roman Empire, when Paul's talking about it, is not a racist institution. It's not based on race. It's not based on ethnicity or skin color. Most of the time, it was economic. You sold yourself into slavery in order to pay back a debt because you owed somebody money. Roman law and Jewish law also had ways for slaves to become free. So when you were in slavery, you weren't bound to it forever, and it wasn't a judgment or an oppression put on you because of something like skin color. And so sometimes what some of us get frustrated by is, well, why doesn't Paul use the language of abolition? Why doesn't Paul say, let's get rid of slavery? And I think there's a reason for that. And again, I can only guess what Paul's saying here. You'd have to ask him yourself. But this is kind of what Paul is doing, and this is what Paul thinks. You and I, because we're Americans, we tend to think the way you get rid of things is through revolution. Because how did we earn our independence as a country? The revolution. And even how did we overcome slavery as an institution? Through the Civil War. And so that kind of tends to be our default mode. When there's something that we don't like, what do? We rise up, we overpower it, and we claim the power. Paul does not operate with that American mindset. Remember, Paul is one of 1,500 Christians in an empire of 60 to 70 million. So how do you enact social change? You don't really have a hope of starting a revolution that overthrows an institution from the top down. What Paul's going to argue for, not just in this issue of slavery here, but really all the way around, is the way you turn an empire upside down is actually from the inside out. That you actually embody a completely different way of life, and you start at the family level, and and you start at the individual level, and individuals operate differently, and families operate differently, and churches operate differently, then eventually you'll turn the entire empire inside out. And so this is what Paul's going to argue for, because what Paul says here is he doesn't use the language of let's get rid of slaves versus masters, but what does he say? He says, masters, what do I want you to do? I want you to wholeheartedly serve your slaves willingly. Again, he doesn't use the language of abolition, but what he's saying is that dynamic that exists, flip it around. the function of it, the way we view other people, these people that you tend to view of, this person works for me, this person's here to do what I want. Paul says, yeah, not anymore. Now it's the other way around. Now you're going to flip it. And you're going to do for them what Jesus has done for you. And so as much as he's not using the language of let's end the institution, he is saying let's not operate with that relational dynamic. There's another book that Paul writes called Philemon, and Philemon is actually a letter that Paul sends with this guy Philemon back to Onesimus. Onesimus is the master, and Philemon is actually his slave. And in the letter, Paul's like, hey, he ran away from you, and I know that wasn't good, but when he comes back to you, welcome him as a brother. And so at no point does Paul argue that one person owning another person is good or natural. It's not. Sometimes even people will say, oh, well, slavery in the Roman world was good because it wasn't racially. I don't think it's ever good for one person to own another person regardless of the context. Yes, a lot of slaves in the Roman world were treated very good, but a lot of them were also treated very poorly. Paul's not saying, hey, this is good. Paul's saying, hey, let's just live a different kind of way. Let's have an entirely different functioning kind of household. And really, that's how we'll enact change. And Paul's right, because what will happen 300 years later is the entire empire will convert to Christianity. So remember those 1,500 Christians that exist during Paul's day? They will actually overcome the Roman Empire. That Paul's means of embodying a different way at the local grassroots level is ultimately what leads to empire-wide change. And so Paul may not be advocating with the language that we want him to for the end of this institution, but he is upending the function and the idea of what it even means. Because again, what he's setting up is here's how we function in our households. Here's how we function as families. And who's ever involved in that, whatever that looks like for you, for me, for the people in the first century world, well, this is how we function differently. We live mutually submissive to one another. And he's gone through and given specific examples. This is what mutual submission looks like in each one of these relationships. Now again, I don't think anything we've said today is like brand new. We've probably all heard this before. There's nothing life-changing. And even in a concept, it's like, yeah, it's a great concept. We should live mutually submissive to one another. But we don't do it. And there's a reason that we don't do it. And the reason that we don't do it is common and universal to all of us. The reason that we don't live mutually submissive to our spouses, to our children, to even extended members of our family, aunts, uncles, or roommates, or whatever, we all have the same reason, we all have the same excuse, and let me just say this, the excuse is 100% true and 100% valid. And here's the excuse. They don't deserve it. You know why I don't submit to my husband? Because he doesn't deserve it. Because he's lazy and he's good for nothing. He comes home and he does nothing. He sits down there and he drinks a beer and he watches sports and he's not interested in our kids at all and he's just worthless. The reason I don't submit to my wife is because all she does is nag and she does this and she does that. The reason that I exasperate my children is because my kids are awful and they don't respect anyone and they're dumb and they're stupid. The reason I don't submit to my parents is because my parents are stupid and selfish and they don't know anything. And here's the thing, all of those, they're all valid. We are all broken people. We are all messed up people. None of us here, it's like, everyone's going to look at us and go, yes, you're the person that's worthy to submit to. Because the reality is, if we had a spouse that was worthy to submit to, we wouldn't mind submitting to them. If we had parents that were worthy to submit to, we wouldn't mind submitting to them. But they don't deserve it, which is 100% true and 100% accurate. It also 100% misses Paul's point. Because if you remember, Paul never said, do this because they deserve it. Paul only had one reason, one justification for why you do this. And he said it in the very beginning. Remember, go back to that very first verse. What did he say? Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Why do we submit to one another? Because of Jesus. Because Jesus, if you go to Philippians, which is another letter that Paul writes in the New Testament, Paul will actually say that what Jesus does, God comes to earth in the person of Jesus, and Jesus literally empties himself. He becomes nothing. He takes the nature of a servant and gives his life for our benefit. And Paul says, because this is what Jesus has done for us, this is what we do for one another. And so the reason I submit to you is not because you deserve it, but it's because of Jesus. And that somehow, as we live these lives in our households and our families that are mutually submissive to one another, that somehow living mutually submissive to one another because of Jesus actually ends up helping form each one of us to become more like Jesus. So there's a pastor in Atlanta area. His name's Andy Stanley, and he came up with what I think is a great question. He said, how do we, like practically, how do we live mutually submissive to one? What's the thing that we do? And he came up with this question. And he said, if this question can be the defining question of each of our families in all of these different relationships, this is how we'll live mutually submissive to one another. And here's the question. It's a simple question. What can I do to help? If that becomes the question that defines each of our relationships, if we come home to the family and you look at our spouses and our spouses had a rough day or they're in the middle of watering plants or whatever they're doing, if our response can be, what can I do to help you? Honey, what can I do to help you? Children, what can I do to help you? Mom, Dad, what can I do to help you? Think about how that would transform the dynamic of our families if that became the question. And again, this is Paul's point. It doesn't matter where you exist, like on the political, socioeconomic status. You could be like, you're the breadwinner of the family. You're the one that makes all the money, and you work really hard, and you come home, but it's like, no, you still do this for your kids. You may be the one who stays home and takes after the kids, and you don't earn a penny, but you take care of the house, you manage all this, and it's like, guess what? You're going to submit to the kids. They're going to submit to you. The breadwinner, like we're doing this to one another, regardless of what are considered like normal roles or even what we play in the socioeconomics of the family. This is what defines the family. We ask this question, what can I do to help you? My family, all four of us, my wife and both my kids, we've always tended to be artists more than scientists. We just are. We kind of love the arts. We're very poetic people. We're into fantasy and things like that. And so math has never been our strong suit. It's never been our strong suit. I'm a really good student in two subjects, one of which does not benefit my children at all, and that is theology. The other one, I'm pretty good in history. Okay, but apart from that, I'm smart and I was a good student, but I also haven't been in school for like 20 years, like the subjects that my kids take. My wife, on the other hand, is like one of the best students I've ever met in my life. She teaches junior high. She actually won at our high school, won like the overall award for like best student. She graduated with her 4.0. If you go to our high school, her picture's up in the office with all these other incredible award winners at our school. And so she's like a really, really good student. And so my kids will tell you that like if they have a choice and they need help for homework, they're going to go to mom over dad every time. If mom's not around, we'll go to dad. And so my wife's always been super great at like helping them, and I help them when I can. And math, because math hasn't been a strong point, it's been the weakest one. But my kids were always young enough that we could still help out. All right, because even though I haven't taken addition or division, like I still know addition, division. But as they keep getting older and older, my son's a freshman now, math keeps getting harder. I'm like, man, I don't know how to do this. And so my son, who's in like freshman algebra now he's learning like functions. And he's like, Dad, come over here and help me. And it's like, f of x is this. And I'm like, oh, I remember learning this, but I have no idea how to do it. And it's like, here's how you graph the slope of a line. And I'm like, I am absolutely lost. I'm useless. I tried one day, and he's like, Dad, I appreciate the help, but you don't ever need to help me again on this. Like, you're worthless. And my wife, who's a much better student, she sits down with him, and she's like trying to teach him. But again, she's an English teacher. So she hasn't taken math in a long time. So she's kind of wrestling through it too. I come home the other day from work, and I walk into our room. She's sitting there at the desk. She's got the computer in front of her. She's watching online videos to learn how to plot the slope of a line and how to figure out the function in f of x. And you know why she's doing that? So she can teach him. Because this is where he's at, and this is what he needs help with. And she's teaching him, and he's learning, and he's getting a good grade in math. Now, there are 1,000 things my wife would rather do than come home from work and go online and watch videos about how to graph the slope of a line. But why does she do it? Because this is what I can do to help. Because you're my son, and I love you, and even though this is your problem, and you got to figure this out, and ultimately this is your grade, this is what I can do to help you. See, that's what mutual submission looks like. We do it not because we have to, but because we choose to do for others what it is that Jesus has done for us. And if we would do that in our closest relationships, think about how that would transform our households. Think about how that would transform, even if you expand it beyond households to friendships, to extended families. If we would learn to do it. And again, sometimes, I get it, sometimes they're not going to deserve it. Sometimes you're going to look at them and you're going to be like, all you're doing is being lazy, or all you're doing is nagging, or all you're doing is being selfish. But when you look at them and you're tempted to be angry fathers, and we're tempted to exasperate our children, you look at them and you say, I'm submitting to you because of Jesus. Because Jesus took everything he was and gave it up for my benefit, even though I didn't deserve it. And so now I'm going to do the same thing for you. Paul says this is what it looks like to be a new kind of household, a new kind of family. In light of Jesus and the gospel, this is how we live. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love for us. And I thank you that you emptied everything. You became nothing. You took the nature of a servant and gave your life for us. And Father, you commanded us to do the same, to love one another as you have loved us. And Father, I know that's difficult. One, because we're stubborn people, but two, because we don't always deserve it. We don't deserve it. Our kids don't deserve it. Our spouses, our friends, our roommates, our aunts, uncles, cousins, we don't deserve it. But God, we don't do it because we deserve it. We do it because of what you have done for us. Because of Jesus. So Father, help us to embody a new way of living, a new way of being. Because God, the reality is what we're becoming is far more important than what we do. And if we have families that are defined by this question, if we have families that are formed around this idea of mutual submission, God, these will be places where we will help each other grow into who you've created us to be. And God, that's the way we transform the world. From the bottom up, from the inside out. By showing people, by showing the world, by showing ourselves, by showing our spouses, by showing our children a completely different way to live. A way that's rooted in Jesus. God, we love you and thank you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.